Okay, so we got to the final panel, all the brave people that are with us. And we'd like to invite the panelists. Professor Shailev is sharing with me. Professor Vardit Ravitsky, Professor Dror Harats, and Professor Allan Brandt. So in our final panel, maybe we're going to speak about the elephant in the room. The elephant is the big pharma. At least that's my interpretation. The title, what social responsibilities, if any, should big pharma companies and other large private companies have? And it seems that throughout the conference, starting from Allan talks yesterday and today, I think I mentioned in one of my questions that for me it's like a Ptolemaic system that for me it seems to fall, not sustainable. That's one interpretation. We saw so many problems with the current system, and both from efficiency and also from moral, ethical perspectives. On the other hand, we saw the huge success, as many times presented. I'm also presenting it about the vaccines that helped us open the economy, at least in Israel. And of course, vaccines are not the whole solution. There are many other problems. And I want to start maybe with a question about this maybe impossible tension between for-profit companies and the right to health, and this conflict of interest. And then Shai and I were talking before, would be great maybe to discuss, when we're talking about responsibilities, many times people are talking about corporate responsibility, sometimes also in the context of climate change and other things. So what is this responsibility? It's sometimes it's we raised today many concepts, and this is maybe a concept that would like you to say more about. So Shai, I don't know if you want to add a few more things, and we'll start to open the discussion.
Not much, but I do think that it's a very abstract concept, responsibility. So we need to be much clearer about what we mean in practice. And I think sometimes, as we know from corporate social responsibility, it's a great thought, but the questions of implementation are far from the ideal. And then we move to talk not about strong regulation, but about soft law. And then the question is, where do we go from there, and whether it remains an ideal or something that we could actually put some teeth or bite on.
So we'll start with the first round. Then maybe people want to comment on each other, and then we open the floor for more questions. So I don't know, Allan, you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to start. Thanks so much. I'm very interested in exactly this problem of corporate social responsibility. And I invite you to look at some websites. When you have a chance, take a look at the Philip Morris or the Altria website. They have a click on corporate social responsibility. Look at Pepsi's and look at Coca-Cola's. They have a website on corporate responsibility. And look at Big Pharma, because Big Pharma is a little bit different than some of the industries that I've studied and that we're interested in, because Big Pharma, unlike tobacco or big sugar or big food, actually produces a global public good. So we'll have to look at big pharma in a slightly different way than I might look at tobacco. But go on the corporate the corporate responsibility part of the website for British Petroleum or Exxon. And again, you know, they produce carbon fuels, they produce things we need. But if you looked at these websites, you would think that these are the most ethically principled industries in the world. And if you're watching the news, at least in the United States, and I assume on commercial channels in Israel, it's very much the same. If I ask people, who's doing the most about the environment, you might say British Petroleum. And they run ads all the time about how deeply they care about our environment. And yet, at the same time, if as a historian or a sociologist or an investigator, you've looked at their archives and their documents, it's very clear, you know, where they place corporate social responsibility. It's a crucial public relations concern for them. Since the pandemic in the United States, if you are watching television or, you know, the news, Big Pharma's come on, and it essentially says Big Pharma is absolutely committed to equity. So as we have made equity a source of value in our ethics, our industries are also saying, we're lining up right with you. So it makes the world very confusing, and it masks something that now people, instead of saying the social determinants of health, they're looking much more explicitly at the industrial determinants of health. And on that balance sheet, even for Big Pharma, there are incredible harms. And the harms go two ways. We don't have the drugs we really need. We produce drugs that really service many people for diseases that are not really the main diseases. Drugs are judged principally by the value and profit that they create. So the industry has a tremendous interest in producing drugs that are expensive and valuable and will be used multiple pharmacy without really considering the public health and the epidemiological views. The way I came to understand this was really by studying tobacco. And, you know, I didn't expect the tobacco companies, you know, to be honest. But when you really see the tobacco industry documents, it is, well, I guess you would say even for somebody who is sometimes as cynical as I am, is just mind-blowing. And what they said, for example, as tobacco public health regulation came into being, they said many people are quitting, especially in well-educated and affluent countries. So if we're going to address this corporate problem, our companies will be dead in 25 years if people keep quitting, but we don't produce new smokers. And in their documents, they called the children that they would then solicit to sell cigarettes to replacement smokers. Not my term, the industry's term. And what did they do when it became clear that people were quitting? They said, you know, we can make nicotine by doing science even more addictive. So, and we can sell it to kids. And, you know, no one's going to start smoking pretty much when they're 22 or 23. But if we can get very young smokers to start, that's the key to our industry. I just want to say quickly, it's somewhat different what we've just watched during the pandemic and with the commercial vaccines, especially Pfizer, which has already come up, and Moderna. But when the United States offered companies a tremendous bonus to produce vaccines, safe and effective vaccines, and vaccines which have saved many lives, it was an incredible bonus to these industries. And it was signed over, even though there was a public interest in doing this, without any constraints on how the vaccines would be distributed. So we live in a world now where many of us are vaccinated, especially places that have excellent healthcare systems and are affluent. But if you look at the low-income countries in Africa, the rates of vaccination, even today, are often 25%, in some countries lower, in some countries a little bit higher. But the implications of that really defy any notion of what is a public good. And I guess my argument would be in instances where in industry, and I have to say a necessary industry, none of our governments were prepared to produce vaccine in this kind of a volume. But if you're producing a public good, there are real public responsibilities, not what I would call corporate public responsibilities. So I think I'll end there, but look forward to talking more about this.
Thank you so much. Dror, you actually working quite a lot, I guess, with the pharmaceutical industry in your research.
Not just that, I'm sitting in both sides of the fence.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I'm a CEO of a biotech company. So first, I'm glad that you were making this separation between companies like the tobacco companies and the pharma companies. It's a completely different issues. Now, before I'm saying anything, we have to understand that the big pharma companies are not actually the ones that are developing drugs anymore. They don't really have research abilities anymore. They're buying biotech companies. They're buying other companies to extend their businesses. So we have to separate the early and later stage biotech companies and the big pharma companies. Now, we can't live without them. Let's be serious. Yesterday and today, together, the NIH and us discovered that we have the right sequence for the next monoclonal antibody that can work in the patients that are not having the right immune system and have to fight with the new COVID-19 virus. And in the last 36 hours, we are trying badly to find a way to make this antibody. And the American government cannot make it, the Israeli government cannot make it. In Israel, we don't have a facility to make monoclonal antibodies. To go to a CMO to make, you will have to wait 6 months. You will have to pay tons of money. Why? Because it's not profitable. And we have to face reality. Pharma and biotech company are for profit. And they have a fiduciary responsibility for their shareholders and investors. And they cannot go around it. And even Pfizer are going to face now a problem. They were so successful, then the next year they're going to be judged if they're still growing. And you will be surprised that the CEO will have most probably to go home because he can't show it to the shareholders. So we have to understand that we cannot just blame them. On the other hand, it's not profitable to make antibiotics because we won't let the doctors give the new antibiotics until they exhaust all the old ones for public health. So for many years, the bugs are actually winning the fight. And we have more and more bacteria that are resistant to everything that we can give to our patients, and patients die. If they'll keep on winning, we won't be able to do one surgery. We will go back 100 years. And that's a responsibility of governments. Because if the companies for profit won't have a profit on that, how can you force them to do it? Either you have to give them money, and all the governments were basically sleeping. And we were saying it, preaching that you have. So now the US government is giving some grants and others because it's quite clear that you can't ask a company that needs to make profit to make a product that will never make a profit. So that's, I know it's not very popular what I was saying, but that's reality. On the other hand, what I blame these companies is not because they are cheating and putting all these very nice things on their website. Whoever believes that, I was on the cover of the BMS booklet for the shareholders about 20 years ago because we did a genetic study in Jisr Azarka, and there was a picture of Caesarea, and a picture of Jisr Azarka, and they interview me how I'm helping Jisr Azarka. Wonderful. They did it because they wanted to develop a drug for asthma. And the people in Jisr Azarka have inherited asthma. But it was all covered. And I don't blame them, and I don't even count on them that they will do the right thing. What I want from them, to spend money on research, because that will help us to actually build the next thing. And maybe other people need to actually put more money for other social, I would say, means or anything like that. But what I really blame them, and they hear it from me, that many times they are not honest. And they're willing to pay a huge penalty because then they can sell the drug for a lot of money. The antidepressant drugs were developed in a randomized controlled trial that showed maybe a 1% difference. And then Eli Lilly had to pay $1 billion as a fine. But they sold it for many, many billions of dollars to many people, and they convinced that the primary care physician can give this drug. Now tell me a patient that was getting an antidepressant drug, and 2 years later or a year later you want to stop it. Then you ask the patient and said, maybe I feel a little better. You know what? Maybe I could feel worse if I wouldn't use it. Now, I'm dealing with metabolism and they are gaining weight. So I'm stopping the drugs and they don't get worse, most of them. Because they were getting it because someone was pushing it. So that's one thing. The other thing, they don't show all the data that they have. You know that the drug that Pfizer developed for corona, they had another study looking at what does it do to people that were either vaccinated or already infected ones. The study came negative. You never heard about it. They came with all kind of explanation why it wasn't done in the right way, why you can't interpret the data. So they are crossing the line, in my mind, in many cases. When I talk to them, and I talk to them a lot, I'm saying it clear and loud, and I give them the examples, and the Pfizer management people heard it from me because I said that the other study that they start selling the drug is also have so many holes in it. And then we learned that when you give the drug, the people don't develop the immune reaction. And then if you give it for nothing, the people will get sick again. But they also know it and they don't publish it. So that's a major thing. I think that we should actually find companies like that in a painful way. In a much more painful way, that, for example, it's not just money that the management will have to pay in their job. And I'll tell you how they're paying in the job in a different way. Gilead did a deal on a CAR T. Everybody that understood this cell therapy knew that this deal is a big mistake commercially. Nobody will ever get the $11.5 billion that they paid. It took 1 month for the chairman and the CEO not to be the chairman and CEO of Gilead. Everybody in the industry understood it. So people pay for mistakes, but not the type of mistake that we want them to pay. So I'll stop here.
Just a clarification. So many of the things you discussed were part of answering what is responsibility?
Yes, because I think their major responsibility is to be honest about the research, to be honest that they are here to make money, and the role is developing new drugs. And if they would have said it clear and loud, nobody would come after them. Why didn't you take care of little kids' education in Africa? Your role is to put refrigerator in Africa so we can give your drug. Your role is to give the anti-AIDS drug free of charge in Africa. In your business, do it. And for them, then the benefits that we'll get from this responsibility will be much higher, because they will expand. I mean, the expense that they will pay, let's say it's $1 million, the benefit can be $100 million. So I don't want them to be involved in things that it's not their business. They don't know how to do it right. They should be honest. They should develop drugs. They should put money to develop the next generation of drugs. And they should be philanthropic in the field of medicine. There is enough to do in the field of medicine to be philanthropic, but it's completely different than tobacco. Usually they don't cause that much harm in their business. Some harm they do cause.
Interesting, thank you. Vardit.
I'll try to answer the question of what is the responsibility. And first of all, I'll go back to very familiar old concepts of justice, access, exploitation, and who benefits. And that goes back to very well-established principles of research ethics. So I don't think we can tell for-profit pharma what drugs to develop and what conditions to address. But we can tell them as a society through regulation that they cannot go to a poor country, exploit local populations to take on all the risks, and then ensure that the benefits from the development go to rich populations in other countries. That has been said a million times. Is it actually being enforced? You tell me. But this is really an issue of who takes on the risks, who gets the benefits, and at least ensuring principles of justice and fairness are maintained globally. That seems like a no-brainer. From a bioethical perspective, how it plays out in real life is more complicated. The second issue is, I think we have a responsibility to patients where there is no profit to be made. Because my field is genetics and genomics, I'm thinking obviously about the rare disease community and the issue of orphan drugs. And there sometimes what I'm hearing as a response is, well, there's complementarity. Big pharma will look at profitable interventions, and the public will fund the research leading to less profitable drugs, interventions, diagnostics, etc. Is that a sufficient answer? I don't know, but that's the usual answer. Can society say to pharma, for every blockbuster Viagra or heart medication they develop, you have to address, you have to divert a certain percentage of your investment towards less profitable, more rare conditions? Again, I don't know, I'm not an economist, but it's one possible way of looking at responsibility. And the third issue I want to put at the table is maybe controversial, but is this really private? So you just talked about how the government gave private pharma the grants to develop the COVID vaccines with no strings attached. They went ahead and made billions. You both mentioned it. So is this really purely within the commercial space? Is it really black and white that this is funded by public money and this is funded by private money? No, obviously it isn't. So what does that do for responsibility? Obviously, here the responsibility towards your shareholders, and here it's to the public. But can we say that because it's not a black and white distinction, who actually funds this? And I'm going back to Jonathan's notion of welfare. Welfare is invested in this as well. That's human suffering, human risk, human time that goes into research done in the private sector as well. That is not much of it not accounted for, as you explained to us brilliantly. So if the division between public and private is not that clear cut, can't we generate corporate responsibilities based on that? And to what extent? Again, don't know the answer, but I think it's misguided for us to think in this in a way that's too dichotomous.
At least one part that you were saying, there are rules. You can't go to the FDA and get an NDA and an approval of a drug if at least 50% of the patients in the trials were not done in North America. So they put these rules. On the other hand, I can tell you that to do trials in a very poor countries where the medical system is not really working very well is not successful, and pharma companies, I blame them not going there, because then the population there don't get a chance for early exposures to some very good drugs. But we also in Israel almost force the big pharma to do some of the clinical trials here, because otherwise we cannot advocate for the drug because we never used it. And you can't give a drug or to the patient. It's very difficult to advocate for it as an expert if you never used it. So we are pushing to make more clinical trials in many countries, and actually I think it's for the benefit of the public usually, in most cases.
So I just want to make two observations following what was already asked, and then maybe Nadav suggested that we open it up also to the audience. But when one goes to the asymmetry between different kinds of industries, which Allan hinted at and Dror emphasized and was repeated by Vardit, and the asymmetry goes both directions. One direction is that pharma does less harm than some of the other industries. So in that sense, brownie points for pharma. But then on the other end, there's a certain kind of donation of the public, right? Because science is seen in general, and participation in research is seen as sort of for the benefit of humanity and not for private benefit. Therefore, and again, this goes back to Jonathan, the citizens invest in these researchers, their time, risk, etc. And so, yes, there's an asymmetry, but it goes in both ways, and there's a question of what follows. Then also, what Vardit was saying, you know, and then Dror was seconding that it's obvious that you can't exploit third world countries. But then what happens in your country, right? Who benefits and who doesn't benefit? So why is exploitation why are we so sensitive? Are we so sensitive to exploitation with third world countries? And then within the country, there's a question of who gets to benefit from the drugs and who's exploited. And these are questions not only of inclusion, but really of who benefits from this. And then a broader question that I think comes up is the different ways of whatever responsibility we think industry has, what are the ways of enforcing it? And sort of there's on the one hand, criminal enforcement, fines, really strong regulation and law, and then there is public opinion and shaming and PR. And in between, I think something that came up from what Joel said is the responsibility of professionals, of doctors, of physicians, of sort of us, our responsibility, and sort of as playing a role in this field, signaling what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. And I think part of the development of ethical norms in the context of this conference and obviously on other contexts is really important to make sure that we understand what is our demand in this context. Is it enough for them to be honest about what they do, or is there more to responsibility? And I think that's a lot. As Dror said, you know, let's take that first and then ask about what further can be done. But I think we could go further than that. So I guess just observations, and if you want to comment, or we could open it up. There are, I think, already comments. Good. So is there somebody to pass down the mic? If there is. If not, I'll do it.
My voice is strong enough.
No, but we need it for the recording. It's actually more complicated than that.
There is a rule for pharma that they need to spend X amount of money on research.
Yes. My question is about maybe a theoretical option which I would like to hear your opinion about. In the last couple of years, there's been a wide discussion of privatization of various services that have traditionally been given by the state, and now the concern, the option is that privatization is going to take their place. For example, in prison, in the punitive system. Now, my question is, can we think, as my inclination is, about that very fundamental service of research in medicine and pharmaceutical research and treatment in terms of the state duty, which is owed by the state and should remain the sphere of state activity rather than privatized. Now, I am completely aware of the pragmatic and practical and economic problems involved. I'm sure that the big pharma is more efficient economically in providing this service in general. Maybe we should not even be sure about that, but let's grant that. As we grant in the case of prisons, that they are cheaper to run by, if they are run by private firms. But we are in principle against it. And I think I would like to hear your reflections about the possibility of returning back to the state the responsibility for all research. That will be extremely expensive on the one hand, yet the government will have full control over the prices of the of the product later on, and we all will be the stockholders or the shareholders of that project, and that might give us better ethical control.
I want to add on that there are several aspects in what pharmaceutical companies are doing. There's the research and development, and I think, Dror, you hinted to it. There's the research and development that many times is much more public than people thinking. And there is the later stage of finally getting into mass production. And of course, also in between. And there's a lot of private-public mix here. I think, and those who know my work in other places, tomorrow Professor Danny Filk will be here and we'll discuss some aspects. That many times is private-public. It seems excellent, especially for Israelis that like this kind of quick solutions. Maybe they're good for short term, but the long term, and now we have several decades, led us to lots of market failures and things, Dror, that you also hinted. So I'm just taking your very important question and remembering just that there are different aspects, that it's not just a dichotomy, black and white, of private and public. There can be also private-public mix that makes it's even more complicated. Yeah.
The ultimate control should be by the state and not by profit. So you can share some of the parts of the production process with private companies by particular contracts, but that would leave the full control to the state.
There are hybrid models, and some of them I think are really quite good. I'm sorry. I was saying there are hybrid models, and some of them give us some strategies, if you will, about how we might potentially think about this. One thing that's been characteristic of bioethics is an intensively regulatory model. And it seems to me there's no question that if a big industry is producing public goods, goods that have value across the globe, and things that are essential to our health, then government has a intensive regulatory potential that we generally haven't used and haven't used effectively. One of the things to moderate the activities of big industries has been taxes. And there's no reason at all why, if our government was going to invest so strongly in a vaccine which had such monumental global public good in the context of a pandemic, that there shouldn't have been restraints on profits or strategies about intellectual property or giving low-income countries the plan so that they could actually produce vaccines themselves. So there's a lot of discussion going on in the context of COVID about what we really could do, not only to make sure that they don't lie, but even if they have fiduciary responsibilities to their investors, they also have incredible public responsibilities when governments are often the biggest investors. And that's also true in the research and development side. Those countries who have invested in research and development and training of scientists have lost a great deal of value for the production of profits for these industries. So I would just say the one other thing that's going on in the US, and I assume here to a significant degree, is to just look at what the Sacklers did. And they created an epidemic by industry causality. And they lied. They had a product that they lied about. They were highly influential on prescribing physicians. So all these things, I think, require an intense and elaborate regulatory schema and tax schema that could begin to perhaps make this relationship between industry and government potentially more oriented towards public good.
And back to what Dror said, none of the executives ended up in prison. They were fined in a very controversial way, but if the entire group of people responsible for millions of deaths had ended up in jail, what a message that would send the rest of the industry. So Dror, I totally support you on that.
So I'll say couple of things. First, the best way of diagnosis in medicine is a retrospectoscope. We look now at the vaccine story, but I can tell you that when it all started, most people in the academia around me were saying that RNA vaccines are dangerous, it's crazy, it will never work. And I remember a discussion in the corridor of the management of Sheba. There were two people that were actually saying that they will take the RNA vaccine because we are scientists, Gidi Rechavi and me. The pharmacist, everybody was against it. Everybody was against it. Everybody was sure it's not going to work. And when the Ministry of Health were debating where to go, I was involved behind the scene. And in the US government, they weren't sure it's going to work. Now, how did we get this vaccine so quickly? We got this vaccine so quickly because of the HIV pandemic. When the HIV pandemic started, the NIH decided to have the Vaccine Research Center. Because until the HIV, we were sure that we are done with viruses. We have vaccination, we're done, we don't have the Black Flag anymore. Seriously. And then they decided to have the Vaccine Research Center. And Moderna would never, ever be able to develop it if not for the people from the Vaccine Research Center that within a week from the time they got the sequence from China, and by the way, they developed it for cancer. And all the viruses vaccines were developed for cancer. So research many times mature in a place, and then the government couldn't make the decision to develop it because they don't have the means how to develop drugs. By the way, governments never developed drugs. They control medicine. They actually put more, I would say, make it more expensive because of the regulation. And I'm not against the regulation. I think that the FDA is very important and we prevent some major mistakes and whatever. But going back to the public, it's only in putting a lot of money in research and maybe put some more taxes or enforce them to pay back. Some of it is happening right now. When I was at UCSF, the guy that went to work at Chiron was the head of the CVRI, one of the best research institute, government institute in the West Coast. And he was fired because you can't work in industry and in academia at the same time. I'm talking 92, 93. Then they looked for a head of the CVRI. And after 4 years, his deputy, that was so much less than in any level that this guy was again a head of the other part of Chiron, one of the force. And he was became the head of the CVRI because they did understand at UCSF, which is a government medical center, completely public, that unless you allow these smart people do both things, you're going to lose. Nevertheless, they're getting a lot of IP now in these medical centers. So it's paid back to the research, but we have to find a better way to do it.
Probably.
Probably.
This is actually a continuation, it follows on. And I've been thinking about this throughout the day. What are the priorities of biomedical research? Because it's either profit, but what else are our priorities? And I think that we need to look at it, not just in terms of we're talking about profit and ownership, intellectual property, versus public good. And the public good in the healthcare system goes far beyond medication. Even if we look at the devices that are also part of the hospital system nowadays. But we've got people giving care to other people. And we mentioned earlier prevention, etc. But even that element of what are really our priorities? Where have we, I've been thinking about this all day, where have we come after 70 years of biomedical research? What have we achieved? What is lacking? What is most important in the public good to invest in?
Okay, now I'm on. Just to introduce myself, I'm Norm Lewison from Chicago. I'm a hospital chaplain and served in the VA, the Veterans Administration, as a member of the IRB and also at one point chair of the Ethics Committee. What I'm thinking about in a kind of longer memory is first of all, the NIH seems to have financed almost all of the developments of the drugs that were eventually sold by Big Pharma, and the universities. And the universities, as I understand, now have all developed quasi-commercial relations so that they can actually sell what they're developing. And it seems to me that those two places are the places to go and say, this is what we need, and we won't produce for Big Pharma if you don't also do the things that society needs. So I just make that as a suggestion.
One more? What you're saying? We collect one more and then can you handle it? Okay.
I turned it off.
Again, it's really interesting. I think that we can agree that the current system is faulty. Something is wrong. We have seen, with the Vioxx and with the opiates and with the fact that the interventions that are good for public health are not well studied and promoted, meaning that whatever, promoting your physical activity or drinking tap water or doing things that are good for your health but are not for profit, we are not investing the same amount of studies, not only for rare diseases. Now, for the discussion, I think that, what's social responsibility for the Big Pharma, to continue on what David said, what are the social responsibility of the government? And I think that this should be our focus. We should see how we better regulate the accountability of the industry, because we see that when they are doing something that went wrong, they don't really accountable for what they did. So something, again, is wrong with the way we regulate them, but also see how we take our tax money to make sure that it's invested in promoting public health, which is not done enough at the moment. And I cannot, again, to continue our previous discussion, I think that we have to ask the large questions, meaning who is directing the agenda of the research? And again, we need the public, or through the government, to direct what we need. And we need research that answer what we need, not answer what is the most profitable way. And there is a lot of research on how to get people to buy something on the internet, but there is much less research on how to get people to choose the healthy behaviors. So again, I just want to be, not to be provocative, but to see, okay, how, with the panel, how we change the system to put our health at the center and not profit at the center.
I want to address Kamal's question, and it was the first question, so I'll go first. Kamal, I've been thinking about priorities in our research agenda as a society for a long time, because I sit on several advisory boards that do just that advise public funding agencies about how to build the future agenda of of biomedical research. And I think that the issue of you can't tell us what to study that we're hearing from pharma is mirrored in the public domain. For most countries with robust funding mechanisms, public funding mechanisms for research, the greater percentage of investment is in investigator-driven research. It's not in the targeted, tailored call for applications. That's a minority. And I think we just believe, just as we believe in the advantage of a free market, we believe in the advantage of a free market of ideas. And we think that science needs to be a little bit unpredictable. And sometimes we invest in something thinking that it's only basic, and very fast it becomes applicable. And we're afraid of regulating that too much. We want to leave it to the scientists, to the researchers, to come up with the brilliant ideas. And sometimes we don't know how this will play out. So I think the problem is not just in the private sector. I think it's a societal issue of how much do we want to control academic freedom and innovation and creativity based on our value-based priorities. Now I want to say a word about our value-based priorities. I don't think they're clear to us. My research team has been working for several years now on how to define what is considered a serious disease or a serious condition. We use the term serious all the time. We use it to decide when it's appropriate to use risky, novel biotechnologies. The first genetically edited baby will have to target a serious mutation. You know, Dr. Hay in China did it to prevent transmission, the infection with HIV. That wasn't serious enough. We have to find something truly serious. Governments fund screening programs based on the criterion of serious. We use it across the board. We use it less for creating priorities in what to study, but implicitly it is sometimes there. But we don't agree as a society on what we consider to be serious. Is it about life expectancy? Is it about pain and suffering? Is it about quality of life? Is disability a part of it? Is it mental health? Is it physical health? Excruciatingly complex issue in defining a concept that should be underlying many of our value-based decisions in this area. So I think like anything else in resource allocation and priority setting, these are some of the most challenging issues in bioethics conceptually, and therefore it's almost impossible to implement them into policy, even if we wanted to, and I'm not sure we even want to. So.
Yeah, the basket of medication is a different, complicated story. You're right about it. We spend a lot of money sometimes on very sophisticated drug. There is a lot of pressure, and I really don't want to get into it. I want to second you that something is really working. We live longer. We live with a better health. We have a much better quality of life, and it's across the board. It's much better in some societies, less in others, but in general, something is really working.
Is it because of drugs? Probably
No. It's a lot of things, but medicine is a medicine, not drug.
Medicine is about 10% of it. 90% is social determinants of health and other things.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that at least...
no, it's not, I didn't invent it. I mean, that's...
Yeah, I know. But you know that we are not... Let me put it this way. It depends on what you are looking for. I'll ask the audience, what was the most important invention that actually prolonged the survival of people in the 20th century? When I'm talking about medicine, what was the thing? Most people will say antibiotics. And actually, it's a cardiovascular... What?
Sewage system.
Yeah. No, I'm talking about medicine by purpose, about drug development, because that's what we are talking. And there is a very nice paper in the New England to show that it's a cardiovascular story. We discover hypertension, diabetes, we discover cholesterol, and all of a sudden, when I was a young man or child, some of my students, in my class, were actually orphans because their parents died like that at the age of 40. We don't see it anymore almost. We almost don't see it anymore. And it's not because we drink better water or whatever. It's just that we actually treat these risk factors. We learn something, and Luckily enough, the pharmaceutical companies got the statins at a certain point, and one of the proof that it's a real thing that the doctors believe in, now that it's out of patent, we give it to more patients. Second thing I want to say that academic freedom brought the best things. And the ladies that fought for this RNA technology didn't get her position because it wasn't popular. So if we will decide, I agree with you, what subject we should fund, we're going to go wrong. It's coming from the freedom, the academic freedom. People believe in it, they fight for it, they do what's right, and then it's working. Then I want to blame the doctors. You think that we are behind the narcotic pandemic? You're wrong. Because there are patients and there are doctors and there is pain. And I'm fighting against it all the time. You know how many patients get prescription of narcotic on a chronic basis now in Israel? Every day. Not because of any Sackler family or anybody, because patients suffering, and it's very easy to give them drugs that help them at that point. And we fight against it, and you tell them, you know, patient can die from it. On the other hand, another example why we should blame doctors. Vioxx. Merck made a huge mistake. They came to us and came to everybody. They wanted to have a press conference for the first time at that time, that we will come up and say that there is no cardiological issues with Vioxx. The cardiologist in Israel went to this press conference. They came to us as a lipidologist, and I was asking a stupid question. Why do you come to us? What did you find that you need us to say that you don't have it? And luckily enough, we realized that there is an issue. But so doctors, because they get donation from these pharmaceutical companies, also make mistakes. And then not everything is money, Carmel. Some of the times, it's good that public money goes free of charge to the big pharma. One of the great examples is something that the NIH developed in this pandemic, and it's a way to shorten the time that we can develop what we call monoclonal antibodies by a year and a half. And they decided not to write a patent, not to do anything, to give it free of charge, this whole single-cell sorting. And now all the companies have it. We have it in the medical centers. The Weizmann Institute have it. It's free of charge. It's going to actually enable us to develop so many things. So sometimes it's not only money. You take good thing from the public, you give it free, and it works. Hopefully it will work for all of us.
Okay, I have lots of things to say, but I'll let Allan...
I'm sure. I'm not always in the mainstream.
I have a couple of quick responses, because I think if we just said, well, our principal value is academic freedom, and medical researchers should do just what they want. We actually have very powerful incentives now in our academic environments about what people do and how they do it, and the use of government money. So to say, well, we have to be very careful, I think you're right, but I know a lot of basic science researchers, and what they're doing is they're watching what NIH is prioritizing in terms of the work that they do. And all of you who do academic research understand that there are many powerful interests acting on that world of academic freedom. So I don't think we can really just say, let academic freedom prevail, especially when there are such substantial human costs. And you say, well, we're living longer, but that is also incredibly skewed to whether we're in affluent countries or poor countries. And in fact, one of the things we've seen with COVID is the decline in life expectancies, even in places as rich as the United States. And it's worse if you're a minority or a person of color. So what is the nature of social responsibility? And I have to say, as somebody deeply committed to bioethics, this is not where bioethics has gone. The regime that I identified last night has centered attention on bedside ethics, autonomy, and beneficence. And the definition of justice within our bioethics system is really, you know, we're at square one. So how we really think about the interplay of these incredibly powerful interests is really, I think, the unanswered question. And we're really finding ourselves in the midst of this pandemic, really at the very beginning of trying to figure this out. How do we think about government investment in research and in drugs? How do we think about intensive profits in the industry? And obviously I don't blame doctors, but the industry not only sometimes teaches physicians a lot about how to give medications, the industry has also misled and fed physicians with misinformation about drugs for now at least a generation, going all the way back to the system that Arthur Sackler invented in the 1960s. So I think there are real opportunities here. This is not to be, you know, cynical or negative, but if governments don't take a powerful representation of their commitment to their citizens around issues of for-profit development of drugs, and if we do it only by individual nation states, I don't think we'll ever get to an answer. These are supranational problems. They're like the environment. They're like the status of democracy. And the World Health situation is really a supranational problem. I was off the whole time.
You
so
were off the whole
I'm
time.
glad.
Okay.
I'm glad no one heard my rant. So thank you very much.
No, there's a microphone here, but okay. This was so important. Thank you for saying that. The Association of Schools of Public Health European Region and WHO and many others were talking about moving from vaccine nationalism to vaccine internationalism. The problem is political will. And currently, unfortunately, there is no political will, I'm sorry to say. When Trump was in power, he even was almost banning the WHO. Now, I have lots of criticism on WHO, but we don't have another WHO. We need to see how we can strengthen it. And that's not so easy because I mentioned, and Vardit is also part of it, and Shai, and where is Chagai? I spoke about this group of solidarity in public health. But this is also very tricky because solidarity can be very racist because we're like Jonathan Metzel presented today. So how to push the boundaries and create a different forms of solidarity? When I was teaching in the US, it was very difficult for me to speak even about, now it's a bit more open, but I was saying solidarity and people felt that I'm a communist or something like that. So that's I don't have easy answers, but I think it's also it's not just about government responsibility, I totally agree, but it's also about solidarity. For example, paying taxes is also about solidarity. Like Jonathan said, if people will stop paying taxes because they don't feel that they belong, so this would be like a whole disaster of the fabric of our society. Yeah.
I just wanted to respond, Allan, to you. In June 2020, still mostly under lockdown, the International Association of Bioethics had the World Congress of Bioethics. It was the first one ever virtually. We were really struggling. And I was privileged enough to be the president at that time, and my presidential address talked about how bioethics is decades behind on understanding justice and how the pandemic threw that in our faces and made our ability to contribute to the management of the crisis from a public health perspective much more challenging. So when I worked to prepare my, my speech, I went back and looked at all the presidential addresses of all the previous Congresses, 30 years. And I saw that in the last 20 years, most presidents of the International Association of Bioethics talked about how we're not doing enough on justice. Every 2 years, they gave practically the same speech about the gap and the blind spots and why is it that we're struggling? Is it lack of funding? Is it that it's conceptually too complicated? Is it that we're not recognizing the importance? But for 20 years, leading figures in bioethics pointed to exactly what you're saying, and we're not making progress. Will the pandemic be the turning point? You know, we're asking here, what is the future, what the future holds for bioethical issues. I hope we're finally forced to face the elephant in the room and say we've worked on everything except potentially the most important thing. So are we going to move forward finally?
I have a couple thoughts about that, and they were implied in my remarks last night, but let me make them somewhat more explicit. The argument I made last night was that this regime of bioethics doesn't fit well with our contemporary global dilemmas. So that was one thing I said. But why is bioethics become so important and so big? It's an actually remarkable story that in 1970, bioethics barely existed. And now it is a giant field, academically, regulatorily, in terms of governments, in terms of medical care institutions. And my argument would be that the current bioethics, the bioethics that I'm arguing has failed in many ways, actually serves incredibly powerful interests. And bioethics serves the interests of big pharma. It makes it possible to do this kind of research. Bioethics has served the interest of the medical profession because now they share responsibility with IRBs. Bioethics is taught and there's compliance issues, and it serves interests. That's why it's powerful, and that's why to some degree it has failed. So I think if bioethics is really going to change, then it has to resist in some ways the interests that have constructed it in this orthodox, often dyadic way where we have hospital committees that go in when there's a disagreement between a patient and a caregiver. We have IRBs that can approve studies of premature babies and without a question. So I think part of what this conference is about is asking a question, how can bioethics change? And what are the interests that cause it to be stable in a status quo way and make it difficult for us to approach the issues that are on the table right now?
Wow.
Perfect.
So we think, right, Shai, that with this very strong, and indeed you said it yesterday, but I think now after all the days of discussion, we'll close the day and we continue for sure to discuss these things also tomorrow. So thank you so much for the panelists and for the people here.
Thank you, Shai.
Great.